In the digital age, the mobilization of societal groups via digital platforms, the rise of domestic violent extremism, and the spread of polarization have changed the fabric of democracy. This sparks a question regarding how to preserve the democratic values and maintain a civil conversation while respecting differences in our societies. It remains to be seen how far online manipulation can go, and what is the role of social media companies in ensuring free speech without a risk of it becoming hate speech. Where is the distinction between legitimate social activism and disruptive manipulation aimed at distorting democratic processes? What should be the role of social media platforms and global actors, and what happens if they disagree?
Welcome to our worldwide audience. My name is Raudseps. I will be moderating this discussion on democracy in the digital age. We have a fantastic panel to discuss these questions, and I will start off right away by introducing them. First of all, Ms. Amanda Lind, who has been the Minister of Culture and Democracy with responsibility for sport and national minorities in the government of Sweden since 2019. And the Minister is also responsible for issues concerning media, youth policy, and civil society. We have Dr. Alina Polyakova, who is the President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Before joining CEPA, she was the Founding Director for Global Democracy and Emerging Technology at the Brookings Institution and served as Director of Research for Europe and Eurasia at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Polyakova is Professor of European Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And last but not least, we have Professor Marie-Eva Carignan. She is an Associate Professor at the Department of Communication at the Université de Sherbrooke and Head of the Media Division at the UNESCO Chair in Prevention of Radicalisation and Violent Extremism. Her research focuses mainly on the impact of media in society. Yes, new digital tools and how they affect democracy. I think that this is a topic that we have all been thinking about and discussing now intensely for years. We could devote conferences to this, and that has already been done. We have an hour, so I'm going to start right in with some questions, and I want to start with Minister Lind, who, as a minister, has the power and the ability to directly affect these issues. But I'll start with a broader question, which is, in the digital age, we see that people's ability to participate has expanded, has exploded, and at the same time, we see the opportunities for various polarization and other ways of attacking democracy have also become much stronger. In your opinion, are these two sides of the same coin that can't be separated, or is there some way that we can accentuate the positive and decrease the negative effects of the digital revolution?
Yes, I would like to say that that's something we have to do. I mean, this digital age, it has been given gigantic opportunities to broaden the democratic discussion. That is something I see every day as Minister for Democracy. I mean, not least that we have the opportunity to interact with almost everyone all around the world. We can. This is a fantastic change that has happened in only a few years. Not everyone can follow politics more closely today, both at local, national, and international level. Transmissions from political assemblies, as well as seminars, something that has been more easy to follow, and that is an interesting development. That you can interact with high political leaders. That is also something that really has broadened the democracy and participation in the public debate. So, I mean, this is something we surely must hold on firmly to. So, I mean, the positive aspects are easy to see. I should say that until a few years ago, that was what most of us mostly focused on. And I mean, that was not wrong. We have to develop these digital possibilities. But here comes the but. Now it's time for a more balanced discussion. We have to also, of course, identify the difficulties and the need for political action also. So, I mean, this is a development I've seen also in my own party. And for the first thing to observe, of course, is a challenge that the democratic functions in the global platforms, the social media platforms, it's a challenge. First of all, we have the difficulty for many to understand the rules of the game, the rules of the platform, the transparency. It's not 100%, and I would say that the big platforms can do a better job to helping out with that. And the other thing, the other challenge, the big challenge I see is that when you have this easy access to the public debate, that means also that there is an easy access also for those who want to manipulate the democratic debate and those who want to silence critical voices, hatred, harassments directed to different voice bearers, youth organizations, politicians, journalists. They have all been really exposed in this digital area, and this is a threat towards our democracy, and something that we have to analyze and try to do something about. I mean, you mentioned in the question, is this something that we shall accept? No, we shall not accept this. We have to see that if we want to safeguard our democracies, we have to face these political challenges.
You have studied extremism on the internet, online manipulation, but of course we know that this has always existed. We've always had extremism. We've always had disinformation. Is what we're seeing really a profound change, a categorical change, or is it just a change of degree that we're seeing just a bit more of what already existed?
I think my personal view, I think it's mostly about it's more viewable. It's more easy spread. We see it more. Earlier, you sat in front of your TV and said things. Now you say it so that everyone can read it, and perhaps you step out of the line for yourself also. But we have also the issue with algorithm that makes extreme material more spreadable, and perhaps that change our behavior also. We cannot foresee that this is not a fact. So I think that we have to understand that this is not a quick fix, and we have to see that we have to work in different political initiatives and levels to face these challenges.
Professor Carignan, I have a question for you. Do you also see this as a change in kind or simply as a change in degree in terms of the ability to spread extremist ideas or manipulate with people's thoughts?
Yes, I think it's certainly a change of degrees. So the spreading, like Amanda just said, with the social media, help people to be exposed to that kind of hate discussion, misinformation, false beliefs. So the spreading of the misinformation is really important online. So people tend to be more exposed. For example, since 1.5 years, we are doing research about the COVID-19 pandemics. And what we see is that the people were really, really fast exposed to all the misinformation about the disease. So in 2 weeks, a lot of people believe that there wasn't a real pandemic, believe that the vaccination was a conspiracy or some conspiracy of that kind, because they were exposed to them really fast online. And since the people was searching information about the pandemics, they was really active online, so they were exposed to that kind of misinformation. So it's the spreading and the access to that kind of misinformation, which is really important online right now with the social media. But that kind of conspiracy belief or misinformation existed before, but it was a long-term spread, not as fast as it is online right now. And one of the problem online right now is also that this spreading could bring some people to adopt violent comportment, violent action. For example, we saw it on January 6th in the capital in the US, the people who have first believe or tend to believe in misinformation decide to take action. And sometimes you just need one individual who decide to commit a violent action to have a really important issues after that. So yes, the social media and the online environment, it's a fact that help to spread that misinformation right now.
And from your research, knowing what we know about how this information spreads on the internet, how does that help us find ways to limit this spread and to decrease radicalization, extremism, and the spread of disinformation?
Yeah, it's difficult to. It's really difficult to block the spread of misinformation online. When we look at what's happened online, the problem is that there was no boundaries, so the law doesn't apply to every country. So right now, many countries try to decide what they could do to stop the spreading of misinformation, but it's difficult because it's an international environment and the law is from one country to another, so it's difficult to apply. Right now, what we saw, it's that the majority of the country that decide to adopt law against misinformation, fake news, are authoritarian country who try to control the public discourse and control the discourse against the policy by that way. So controlling fake news, it's not always a solution. And right now we are doing a lot of power to the platforms by themselves, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. They decide by themselves what they could do. And it's a problem because from one platform to another, they don't have the same rules. And sometimes they decide to apply that rules in one circumstance, but sometimes it's long. We saw in the pandemic that, for example, some conspiracy movements like QAnon was really active for many years before this platform decided to take action. Yesterday, we saw what's happened with the decision about Trump, but it's a problem because it's not the same kind of decision from one platform to another. So we will have to think about what should we do at an international level to control that spreading of misinformation. And right now, I think that one of the important solution is to focus on education to the media, education about how the spread of information is going, about how the journalistic process work. The people don't know what the journalists are doing, that they answer to a deontological code. So that is really important to understand which information is good and which information could be false. They also need to have more education to the scientific aspects. So yeah.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Polyakova, Professor Carignan, she specifically pointed to the need for international cooperation, a broader approach, and we see a new urgency. The European Commission has developed a democracy action plan, which also contains sections on protecting the digital sphere. President Biden has promised to convene a summit of democracy, which I assume will also talk about these issues. In your opinion, what are the prospects for closer transatlantic cooperation in protecting the future democracy, specifically against these threats? And what do you see that these countries and these organizations can do together?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Paul, for that question. It's great to see you again, even if virtually, and fantastic to be here with all of you. I want to make a few points before I answer your question directly. And one is that we've come a very long way as an international community and specifically as a transatlantic community since about 5 or 6 years ago. Yes, the problem of propaganda, disinformation, misinformation is not new, but certainly the veracity and the speed of spread and the amplification capabilities we haven't quite grappled with. And I think what Minister Lin said is absolutely true. We're still going through a digital revolution and we still haven't understood the long-term implications of it, but we're going through a transformative global change in all of our societies. And we're still grappling with the rapid nature of that change. And frankly, our inability institutionally, meaning governments, weren't designed in a digital age, and they weren't designed to respond to issues that are happening in the digital age. So we have to understand how we need to also reform our own institutions to be able to respond to much more rapid spread of misleading information and other threats in the non-kinetic domain. But I think we've come a very long way. And the reason I say that is because just 5 or 6 years ago, people in the Washington community, certainly I think in most European countries, with the exception of perhaps Ukraine and Georgia, who experienced propaganda and disinformation from the Kremlin and from Russia for many, many years, and the Baltic states, of course, know this very well. But the majority, I think, of policymakers in the Western European countries, in the United States and Canada, didn't think this was a problem. Now, everybody is aware of the problem. We've moved beyond admiring it. But I think the reality is that we still don't have proper coordination mechanisms, information sharing mechanisms. The EU has been moving in this direction, but we don't have that between the transatlantic countries in the same way. There are some disparate efforts happening at the G7, for example, with the rapid response mechanism they've established. But there's not really a clear coming together of all the different stakeholders in the democratic community to understand how we really need to ensure that the online space remains a democratic space. Because we haven't mentioned the reality, this isn't just about Germany or France, United States or Canada. We're really locked into a battle for the future of this century. When authoritarian models, especially digital authoritarian models, spearheaded by countries like China first and foremost, but that are gaining appeal across the world, are challenging the very basis of our democratic societies. And so unless we are able to work together as a community of democracies to set the appropriate rules of the road when it comes to platforms, regulatory policies, we have to coordinate these, and we're currently not doing that. We have to understand how do we deal with organic domestic disinformation, misinformation from domestic groups in our own countries versus how do we deal with state-sponsored foreign attempts to interfere in our democracies. So right now there are resources at the table that governments have committed, but we're very, very far from having a community conversation where we have governments at the table. We have to have the companies at the table as well. We cannot always treat them as the enemy. They are trying. We can say they need to do a lot more, but they're certainly changing some of their policies. And of course, we need to have the research, civil society, journalistic community at the table as well. Right now, we're not quite there yet, but I think I remain pretty optimistic looking back just 5 years, seeing how far we've come today.
Thank you, Dr. Polyakova. Mr. Lind, I mentioned already the Democracy Action Plan that the European Commission has developed, and they have an interesting phrase in that, which says, we have to develop, quote, a tool to impose costs on purveyors of foreign interference and influence operations. As Sweden's minister responsible for this, how do you see this tool? What could that be to impose costs on people who spread misinformation and polarize society?
I think that the EU is doing very good work. It's good that we have this action plan and that we are discussing these issues. But it is complicated issues. We have to underline that. And in my point of view, it's important that we, no matter how difficult these challenges are, that we always defend the wide reach freedom of speech and also a strong defense of our democracy. And I think perhaps it's not the answer of your question, but I think I want to emphasize two pillars that I think are really important of how we build up the public defense when it comes to information operations. The first is media and information literacy. My panel colleagues mentioned that also. That is so important both for the youth, but also for the elder ones, but perhaps this digital area is quite new. This is really important, that we can make our citizens be able to value the information that they get in their computers and on the platforms and what they read. The other pillar, I think it's important, it is the media policy. How we safeguard the independent journalism and how we strengthen the journalism in in society. But this is trained journalists are essential when it comes to the resilience for the society against disinformation.
I hear the arguments about the need to educate the public, and certainly I would not oppose that in any way. And nevertheless, we know that these social platforms spend immense amounts of money researching the parts of our brain that are not rational, that will not go and check facts, that retweet or repost and like and get sucked into these, sucked down these rabbit holes of various conspiracy theories, where the rational mind perhaps will not be enough to protect them. How do we limit that? How do we protect people from these urges that in other spheres we do that? We regulate, for instance, what people can eat or what people are allowed to sell, knowing that we must protect people from dangerous products. This is also potentially a dangerous product. How can we regulate it? That's an open question to Dr. Polyakova.
Right. So if I could just make a couple of comments here. One, I do think there's a tendency to place way too much responsibility on the individual. Individuals are inundated with information, as you said, Paul, the information delivery vehicles, what we're seeing in our social media feeds, that is highly researched, it's highly profitable, not just for the platforms that are delivering, but for all the intermediaries. The companies are paying for the ads. The companies are the middlemen matching, somebody who's a very specific age group, 18-year-old Asian male in the outskirts of Michigan who likes sneakers. I mean, it gets to be much more targeted than that. I think we're all growing much more aware of those kinds of capabilities. But we can't ask individuals to spend even 5 minutes, frankly, researching what they see in their newsfeed before they share it. I think companies have started to label some content, but we still don't know, because we don't have access to the data from the companies, whether the labeling even matters. So I think what we really need here is a model for when a public health campaign, this is a public health issue. Of course, the COVID crisis has made that very clear with anti-vax disinformation and conspiracy theories. This is a public health issue. And we have solved similar public health crises in the past. One very clear example that I've written about is how, certainly in the United States, but broadly across Europe as well, we moved from a society of smokers, tobacco smokers and consumers, to now that being a relatively rare habit. I mean, it's not fully rare, but it's much more rare than it used to for people to be smoking cigarettes. But the anti-tobacco campaign, the anti-smoking campaign, took at least 4 decades to get us from where doctors were suggesting to pregnant women that they should smoke because it's good for the baby in the 1950s in the United States, to now everyone being very aware of the health risks. And what did it take? It took a trusted messenger, a public health trusted messenger, like the Surgeon General in the United States and the CDC. But more than that, it really took a grassroots civil society campaign, local leaders, local organizations that already had networks in local communities that could engage with people, and they were trusted for that reason. And then eventually, of course, we had legislation and policy and all kinds of different efforts that were aimed at the industry, but that industry piece actually came last in many ways. And now, the industry regulation piece, but now we're doing this a little bit backwards. We want to say, look, all the companies are at fault, so let's break up the companies, let's do X, Y, Z, and that's going to solve all our problems. But the problems are still going to be there. And so I think we really need to think about this in a long-term strategic sense, and not to look for silver bullets because they don't exist.
Anything to add, Minister Lind or Professor Carignan, to what Dr. Polyakova said? Yeah, Professor Carignan.
Yes, what I would like to add is, just like they said, confidence, it's a really important issue also. So media literacy, I still believe it's really important. We have to develop and go deeper in media literacy, but also what our data shows is that the people who tend to most believe in fake news or conspiracy theory about COVID-19 pandemic, for example, they have less confidence in the governmental, the politic, the public health care specialists, and the media. So it's a really important fact to understand that the confidence it's the key. So if the people are more transparent, they make a better communication effort to the population, it will help a lot. The people will tend to choose to get informed by traditional media, by the official sources. So the transparency and the confidence are keys. Also, now we are doing a lot of effort since the beginning of the pandemic with a lot of different initiatives in education, media literacy, but we don't have at that time all the information about is this initiative are effective in short and long-term periods. So we need to evaluate all the different initiatives and focus on the one that seems to work and put more effort on this one. So we need to evaluate this new different kind of initiative, I think.
I have a question from our viewers. I'll compress it a little bit, but the essence of the question is, how do we really differentiate between free speech and unwanted opinion and hate speech? I mean, who draws the lines? And how do we make sure that in trying to get rid of something that we think is destructive, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and limit necessary differences of opinion? Minister Lind.
Thank you. This is a really important question. I think that is important when it comes to what we politicians should do with legislation. We have to have put freedom of speech very high. I think that is fundamental. When it comes to the platforms from Sweden, it's important the work that they are doing now in the EU Commission. This is legislation that we have to handle on a bigger level, not just in every country. And I think that one thing that I know it's very important for the users of these platforms is that we have to have a more openness from the companies about the terms that they have, about the algorithm, and also a transparency on how you, if you have a post that is taken down, how can you do to put it back again? How can you do to appeal? This is important questions. And it's also important that these platforms are fast on putting down illegal material. This is important. I don't think that we can use legislation on when it comes to hatred and some things that are unwanted but not illegal. I think that it's important that we have an ethical discussion then, that we politicians, we behave as good leaders and set standards. We talk about that this is a new digital area, and this means that we all have to develop our approach to the digital tools. I also want to mention trust. We have to have trust in both. Of course, you have to be able to trust governments, information from authorities, and from professional journalists. And it is an important thing for our democracies that we maintain this trust. This is also a way to strengthen the citizens on be able to separate between different kinds of information.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up question, how do you maintain trust? Because there are societies that are low trust, there are societies that are high trust. I mean, are there any specific ways to maintain or build trust that you see, for instance, from your experience in Sweden?
I think the silver bullet comment is quite important here also. Of course, it's not one way of doing this, but I think that transparency is important, that you can trust that your citizens, that your politicians are holding, for example, freedom of speech high. We don't have a goal to limit our opponents' views. But we are trying to have a balanced discussion when it comes to legislation on the digital platforms. This is important, but I mean, it's of course lots of things when it comes to strengthen trust. Trust and democracy, it's two things on a coin.
I'm getting a lot of comments and questions about the issues of allowed speech, prohibited speech, but I think when talking about the digital platforms, it's important to draw a distinction between things that are illegal, as the minister said, and this famous phrase that's been popularized recently, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. In other words, the fact that you can say something doesn't mean that you have the right to propagate it to 10 million, 1 billion followers, however many. How do we draw that line? And it's made particularly, I think, it's apt that we are talking about right now because yesterday the papers were full, the portals were full of the fact that Facebook has not lifted the ban on Donald Trump. He is still not allowed to post on Facebook. He's not allowed to post on Twitter. That doesn't mean he can't say what he wants to. That doesn't mean his speech is prohibited. How do you draw this line between who is allowed to get this massive audience and how they acquire that? Dr. Polyakova, maybe you have some thoughts on this.
Sure, I'm glad that we're bringing up the recent oversight board decision by Facebook. And I think that if we look a little bit deeper into what that decision actually said, it starts to answer this question. One, what the board actually said was that they weren't going to make a decision at this time because Facebook needs to set very clear and very commonly applied, over the board applied policies as to how they assess which accounts, which content is problematic. It's in that gray zone. It's definitely not illegal or extremist, which we can all agree, and there are laws in, I think, every democracy limiting that kind of content, child pornography, violent content, things of that nature. But that gray zone is what we're talking about. Right now, all the companies are making different decisions about that. So we often have seen now that, for example, Twitter takes a piece of content down or blocks an account, but then YouTube doesn't take it down, or Facebook leaves up a piece of it, but not another piece. And so we have this very patchwork approach now. And that's a huge problem because that opens vulnerability, it opens opportunities for individuals to manipulate that patchwork in between the cracks. So they get pushed out of Facebook, they can still go on YouTube. But I think that is where governments must step in to provide the regulatory guidelines and to ask all companies and mandate that all companies, however we define platforms, have a standard set of terms and a standard set of community standards, as they're called, so that users know what is problematic and what is not. But I think the point that we're talking about here is that amplification, that delivery vehicle piece. And here, I have to say, we just don't have a lot of information because, of course, it is intellectual property, how certain content is delivered to certain users, how it gets amplified. We may know little things here and there. For example, if a tweet gets 10,000 interactions, I think, or something like that, a certain threshold. I don't even know exactly what it is. Then it starts to appear in more and more feeds because the algorithm says, oh, this is something interesting a lot of people like, so let me spread it around to more and more people. And I do think companies have made tweaks to the algorithm. We don't know what those tweaks are. And so this goes back to the question of algorithmic transparency. But how do we actually have clarity on how certain algorithms prioritize information without asking companies to share their intellectual property with their competitors, for example? I think this is where the debate is right now, and it is an important piece of the debate that we need to focus on. So of course, amplification is key. Disinformation, misinformation is never going away. I mean, we just have to face that reality. It's always going to be here. And so we have the long-term view of the education piece and how do we do this in a whole of society approach. And then, of course, in the interim, we need to start having the proper investigative tools and the technical expertise. And we really lack technical expertise inside of governments to even understand. If somebody gave you Google's ranking algorithm, I guarantee nobody would be able to make sense of it. In almost every government out there, I will not generalize, but I would be very surprised if we had expertise in every single democratic government that could look at that and even make much sense of it. So that being said, I think there's a lot that we can do here, but it really has to start with more trust and more cooperation between the private sector and governments to be able to set guidelines.
I have a question that's come in that is on topic, maybe a little bit outside the box of this discussion, but nevertheless, I'll pose it to Minister Lind. And this, again, I think addresses this issue of the connection between governments and their populations and how that affects the common understanding of what's going on in the country and reactions to that. And the question is, Minister Lind, could you explain your experiences about your expanding Middle Eastern asylum refugees policies, the effects on Swedish local core values of democracy, open culture, community integrity, and freedom of speech? This is a specific question about Sweden, but I think it deals with some of the issues that have also led to polarization in other countries as well, from what I understand.
I first want to comment something that Alina just mentioned, that I think we should be aware of that we have different legislation in different countries. We have different norms about what is okay and what is not okay. And I think it would be dangerous if we from a political view, is some kind of trying to state what is okay and what is not okay to say on internet when it comes to not non-illegal things. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we have higher demands on the big platforms, because they are affecting the practice of freedom of speech, and not least when it comes to hatred and threats. And in Sweden, we have an action plan to work against that. And one thing is media and information literacy, of course. Another thing is to help the police and the legal institutions to work more with these crimes that are committed on internet. And that is also a way to help the different voice bearers to feel more safe, and that we can trust that the governments and the legal system is handling illegal actions on internet. This is an important question also when it comes to trust. And thirdly, all those who has been exposed to threats and hatred and these different kinds of attacks. This is a really threat towards our democracy, and they must be able to feel that they can stand up straight and can keep on and are not being silenced. This is an important thing, and I think it's a part of this wholeness that we have to work with. When it comes to trust and immigration in Sweden, I would say that we have lots of work doing in Sweden when it comes to broaden the participation in our democracy. It's quite clear that in Sweden we have a wide-ranged freedom of speech, and that is something that, of course, is something that we have no matter who you are or where you come from.
About the future of democracy, and maybe I'll step back and give a little bit of an introduction to that. We know that since the ancient Greeks, for very many centuries, a lot of smart people considered democracy to be very unstable, even a dangerous system of government. Then, sometime in the 18th century, people thought, okay, if we develop representative democracy that somehow mediates the popular will through representatives, then we can gain some kind of stability. That seems to have worked for 2.5 centuries, maybe a little more, depending on the country and the place. Are we returning to a point where democracy again becomes dangerous the way it was to Aristotle or some of the earlier thinkers? Or can we somehow use these digital tools to continue the successes that democracy has had? In other words, how do you see democracy with these in this digital environment developing in the future? And this is an open question to all three of you. I hope all three of you have thoughts about that. Please, who goes first? Minister Lind, I'll ask you again.
Thank you. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, I see lots of possibilities with this digital area. And when this last year, during the COVID pandemic, I have spoken to lots of civil society organizations and also political parties that say that during this time, new persons have knocked on the door and wants to be a part of the organization. New persons have been able to take place in discussions when for some people, it's much more easier to be part of discussions and meetings if they are held on an internet platform digitally instead. So I think that now we have to take all these learnings from this period and take it with us when the pandemic is blowing away, as we all are longing for, and use this as a way to broaden the democracy In Sweden, we are celebrating now 100 years with the female suffrage, and that is, of course, good, but we have to also take more steps. We have lots of people that is too long from democracy right now, and also we have lots of things more to do.
What do you think? Can a stable democracy integrate these digital tools of direct contact between voters and officials and massive mobilization efforts, or do we have to somehow adjust these tools to maintain democratic stability?
I can chime in here a little bit. I think certainly at their core, these tools facilitate democratic discourse and democratic communication. And it wasn't that long ago that is primarily how we thought of the digital revolution, that we thought this was going to democratize the whole world. And now we've come completely 180 degrees. And now we tend to think, okay, well, these new digital tools, the platforms, the ways of communication and direct communication capabilities that we now have are actually undermining democracy. And these things are bad and we need to control them. And of course, the truth is somewhere in between. That there are challenges that we're facing that we weren't prepared to deal with when Facebook, Twitter, and broader internet penetration began more globally. And now we're in a backlash moment where we're also seeing that it's dual use. All technology is dual use. That it's not just positive. And now we have a tendency to think it's all negative. But I think over time, as a society, we are in that debate as we speak. The reason we're having this conversation now, because we're debating what is the balance? What are we willing to accept in terms of the negative consequences, which is disinformation, misinformation? I don't think we're ever going to be able to control that online without moving into a censored online environment, which of course we always want to avoid, and we can't have. That is antithetical to democracy. We should never fall into the trap of becoming like the authoritarian states of Russia, China. They're trying to censor free speech. They're trying to block information. We need to understand what are the costs we're willing to take, the negative consequences, the fallout, and how can we benefit from the positives? But it's always going to be a balance, and we're never going to, I think, accomplish a perfection here. And we see that in everything we've had to deal with as democracies. This is not that unique in that sense. So again, I think democracies tend to move slower when it comes to these challenges because we want to integrate more views and perspectives. But at the same time, in the long term, I feel very confident that we will come out on top because history has shown, and Paul, as you gave us a bit of a historical overview here, but history has shown that in the end, people, citizens, all will fight for their freedom. They'll fight for their liberty, and they don't want to live in a censored authoritarian kind of environment. And at the end of the day, those ideals and those principles is what we really have to hold on to if we're going to come out on top as we see growing and growing challenges from the authoritarian side of the world.
Professor Carignan, your thoughts about the digital tools, the digital space that we're living in, and its effect on democracy in the coming years?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the colleague. I think it's really important to just find the right balance between an environment that is controlled for misinformation and violence, but also free of speech. And when we look at authoritarian country like China, yes, they control the social media because they want to control the political debate. So in the pandemic, what we saw, for example, is that the social media could be a tool for hate discussion, but they also could be a tool to helping people become more resilient and understand what's happening. Right now, we have an experimentation with the young people and young people who chat online about the pandemic and their preoccupation on social health issue and social and health issues. And what we saw is that chatting online talking about how they feel anxious, sometimes depressed, help them to understand what's happened. And so it could be a real good tool if it's well used. And right now we are working on another experimentation, which is called Science Up First. And it's a scientific community in Canada that bring up together that website and social media platform. And we try to make some visualization of scientific point of view to spread it on the internet and helping the people to get access to scientific information. So I think that kind of initiative where we try to engage dialogue and spread good information online could really help to give the keys to the people, and they can decide by themselves what they decide to trust and how they want to act online. But I think we have to be also to trust the people. They are able to make the decision for themselves if we give us the good tools, and if yes, they think that the government and the media have enough transparency to give them all the information they need to make a good decision about their life and their social behavior.
We've mentioned polarization, and I have a comment here that's come in that I think is a good example of the degree to which our societies are becoming polarized. The comment is, it doesn't seem like the events of January 6th at the US Capitol are being factored in. These people have very clearly declared war on anyone that's anti-racist or anti-fascist. It's not a theoretical philosophical debate. This is war. And the question that this comment leads me to ask is, we see that these digital conflicts have real-world, non-digital consequences. To what extent can we solve these digital conflicts within the digital space? And to what extent do we have to go outside the digital space to calm temperatures, calm people down in the social media sphere and in other places on the digital tools? Who would like to take a stab at that question? Dr. Polyakova, yeah.
I could start because I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., where, of course, this quite concerning and terrible event happened. And I was also here for that. And it was not a great moment, to say the very least, for democracy in the United States, to see something like this happen and to see
the beacons of democracy, the White House, the Capitol, being surrounded by barbed wire and fencing. That was not a good sight for the United States. But that being said, I do think that we have done the kind of investigative work, and by me, I really mean in the United States, is the work of the FBI and intelligence agencies that have for decades monitored extremism in real life, obviously before we had the online space, and are continuing to do that now. I think the danger I see is the proliferation of these fringe sites or platforms. Parler is the one that became more popular now, but that's certainly not the only one. And the ability with which these extremist groups, and I want to say this is not the majority of the population, and these are still extremist groups, but our digital world is a reflection of the cleavages and divisions we have in our physical world, with the key difference that it's like taking a magnifying glass to those divisions. So what we see online tends to be more extremist, more radicalized, and it leads to this network closure so that your views may be radical if you share it with your neighbor that you don't talk to very much and say, oh, that's quite extremist. I don't really agree with you. But then online, you find like-minded people who think the same ways, and you start to think your views are actually quite mainstream. And so I think to a lot of people who were part of the attack on the Capitol, even as bystanders, once they were there and they went through that experience, many of them in interviews later said that was quite a shock to them. They really didn't anticipate something like this to happen, because it's one thing to write online, it's something to experience physically. But I think my broader point is that it has to start in building connections between people in real life, because online, you don't know who you're talking to a lot of times. You can have whatever personality or persona you want, and you'll find like-minded people who are not going to go against your views. But in the real world, you might find that. And I think that what I'm really, really concerned with is that we're in this loop now. It's not a one-way street. what was happening in the physical is reflected in digital. Of course, it's all becoming a two-way street, and a bit of a vortex now. And so the kind of divisions we're seeing online are now also being reproduced in real life. And in the United States, that is leading to, I think, an unprecedented polarization in our society that is being reflected in our politics and is being reflected in just how people refuse to communicate with each other. And this is where I see the concern. And I hope that, many people probably experience the inability to talk to their own family members. But I think it's about constantly trying, even though it's very hard.
Professor Carignan, how do you see working outside the digital sphere to calm emotions in the digital sphere?
I totally agree. I think it's really important to have that dialogue and understand what's happened at the social level that explain that violence online. And what some of our research have shown in the last few months is that the people who are part of a group that feels to be, didn't accept in the social place, a group that feel unsecure, that feel censored, tend to have more sympathy to violence comportment because they legitimate violence as a way to make themselves heard and make themselves believe. So the dialogue with this group are really important. And what the Facebook decision, the oversight board Facebook decision yesterday shows also, it's that they said that because Trump action online were susceptible to cause violent act, that's the reason why they shut down his social platform. But for many years, these platforms tolerate violent discourse from many individuals. For example, the QAnon movement was really active online for many months before they decide to cut the violence discourse of this individual. So the spreading of violence in this discourse was already there. And it's a problem because when they go to other platforms, for example, we just talk about Parler, Gab, or other alternative platform, it's really difficult for security issues because these platforms are more difficult to follow. So we lost trace of what's happened in the violent discourse. So it's more easy for the security and the police officer to follow this group with in Facebook or in Twitter and YouTube than on Parler or alternative platforms that tolerate that violence behavior.
You think that public policy, government policy can do to bridge these cleavages that develop online? Minister Lind?
Excuse me, can you repeat?
Yes. Is there anything that government policy or public policy can do to bridge these cleavages that emerge online to get people talking again and to make society less polarized?
Oh, I think it's I think that is an aim for every politician in every area to build a sustainable society when it comes to the social perspective. I mean, the school is so important. At school, every child meet and are able to talk and discuss these things. So the teachers are really important there. And when it comes to the welfare systems, the possibility to get a job no matter who you are, the work within non-governmental organizations to build more strong social society, this is really important. And here in Sweden, we have actually dialogue activists that are having like their goal to get people to talk with each other, to sit down and talk with different ideologies and political perspectives. It's always more hard to hate someone that you have met and sit down and talk to. And I think this is something that we all can be a part of. Both when it comes to the norms at the digital platforms, what you accept, which norms you set as a political leader, and also as a person, but also that we always try to look at each other as persons, as human beings, and treat each other with respect. But I mean, the goal to make this society better for everyone, it's a way of, in my point of view, try to work against the polarization. But I also want to say, we have a tendency to call different views, different political perspectives as polarization. I want to warn about that, because it can be a way to silence different perspectives, and this is not good. But we have to handle it, and we have to understand that these different opinions are taking to extremes at social media and in the digital world. So that is something we have to understand and handle, not always with legislation, but I think by moral discussions, by norm building discussions, and by dialogue and meeting each other.
Okay.
IRL.
We're coming to the end of our discussion. We have just a little more than 5 minutes, and I'd like to ask each of you briefly, the digital space seems designed to make us angry. It often makes us depressed. You can go in there and come out feeling as if the world is going to hell in a handbasket. What, if anything, makes you optimistic? Just a short answer, but maybe you can end with a few points of light in this discussion. Dr. Polyakova, please.
Well, Paul, thank you. I feel like I've been the optimistic American in this conversation most of the time. That there's of course, we have challenges, but again, if we look back to where we were even 5 years ago, the level of discussion we're having now, it's very different. We are looking at specific solutions. We're understanding the complexity of the problem. It's not easy. We're nowhere near solving it. That is the truth. But we've come such a long way in working together. And in the long term, you may not feel like it now, but in the long term, again, history has shown us that democratic governance wins. And our ability to work together, while slow at first, will prevail. And so I remain very optimistic in the long term, but I still think we have a lot more challenges ahead in the short term that are going to make us feel like we're not going to get there. But I think we have to always see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Professor Carignan, what makes you optimistic, if anything?
Yeah, what makes me really optimistic is that pandemic with the so-called infodemic bring lights on social media issues and platform issues, and now we are talking about it like it was just said, more deep issues. So I think we are not talking about these issues, so it's important, and we are taking action also. The government invests a lot of money and effort in research on this platform, on ways to better communicate. So I think the investment in research is really a good sign. Also, we are working on vulgarization, scientific vulgarization, which is also a good sign, and on media literacy. For many years right now in Canada, we were talking about having more media literacy initiative, and now we are starting to taking action about it. So it's a beginning for maybe having a better online environment after that pandemic, I think.
Minister Lind, what makes you optimistic?
First, that we have a more balanced debate right now. Second, I think we have a broad understanding about the challenges. And third, I think we have now evidence that has been more clear during this pandemic, how much the digital area, the digitalization is meaning to us, and the possibilities to broaden the knowledge of the whole world and to strengthen the democracy. We have to see the possibilities and build on the experiences that we have made, the digital steps that has been taken during the pandemic.
I think it's time to wrap up the discussion. I think it's been an excellent talk. I learned a lot. I hope everybody watching learned a lot. Thank you very much to Professor Marie-Ève Carignan, to Minister Amanda Lind, and to Dr. Alina Polyakova. That concludes this discussion.